Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horn, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. By now, you've heard me say it a number of times that DEI is no longer simply, quote unquote, nice to have, but it is an imperative if our workplaces and organizations are going to be successful moving forward. And my guests today are working to make this imperative a priority throughout the agricultural sector. And given that we have so much to talk about, I want to get right to it. So today I'm asking, why is DEI key to the agriculture sector's success? And to answer today's questions, I'm joined by two special guests, Hannah Konschuh and Erin Gowerluck, hosts of the Diversity Imperative podcast. Hannah and Erin, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
So before we get started on the question, just a little bit more about Hannah and Erin. Hannah is a grain farmer operating Generation Land and Grain Company Limited near Cluny, Alberta, growing wheat, canola, barley, and yellow peas. She completed a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and a Master's of Science in Soil Science from the University of Saskatchewan, and went on to work in a number of research and policy roles prior to joining her family farm. Hannah is a past director with the Alberta Wheat Commission and has served in various other leadership roles with the agricultural sector, both locally, provincially, and nationally. Through Hannah's industry work, she learned firsthand the importance of thinking not only about who is at the table, but valued and meaningful contribution once you've pulled up a chair. Erin lives in Ottawa, where she holds the position of Executive Director of the Grain Growers of Canada. Erin is integral to the organization's operation and policy work and advocates the federal government to make decisions that are in the best interest of the more than 65,000 Canadian grain farmers. Prior to this, Erin worked as a manager of government and industry relations at Syngenta Canada, where she worked to forge collaborative opportunities across Canada's agri-food value chain. She's also held senior policy roles for the Alberta Barley and Alberta Wheat Commissions and worked in the policy research for the Alberta Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. As one of the few women in an executive role in the agriculture sector, Erin has a keen sense of her responsibility as a leader in the sector when it comes to stewarding the agriculture sector's workforce. She recently completed a master's in organizational leadership from Royal Roads University. Hannah and Erin, welcome.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.
So let's talk about this. I mean, before we chatted, I'll be honest, I hadn't really thought about DEI in agriculture. I don't know if I'm alone here, but I think I've got the mental model of a farmer who's in a plaid shirt, dusty jeans on a tractor, and usually white men, and I don't think much about it.
With this song today.
That's my blind spot. So tell me more about what you guys are working on.
Well, thanks, Melissa. Maybe I'll start by trying to situate the sector, I think, within the broader context, maybe of the Canadian economy. And, the entire sector is really one of the key drivers of Canada's economy. We employ about just over 2 million people. We provide 1 in 9 Canadian jobs. And the sector generates about $139 billion with respect to Canada's GDP, which is about 7%. So, a number of more recent reports have also indicated that agriculture is one of the sectors that holds tremendous potential. And I think that this is important for us to consider now, especially when we come out of this post-pandemic economic recovery that we talk a lot about, as a sector to look to kind of help bolster the recovery. And, one thing I think, if you don't have a farming background, that a lot of us are thinking about, I think, as individuals, but also in terms of where we work within the Canadian economy, is climate change. And, Canadian farmers are on the front lines of a changing climate. And so I think we're a sector that talks a lot about innovation and the need to adapt and the need to, to maintain our competitive advantage in the international marketplace. All of these things are very important to Canadian farmers and to those of us, myself, who's not a farmer unlike Hannah, but who works within the sector. And I think, to support some of those broader objectives, and I think we'll talk more about that, we have to talk about our greatest resource, the people who work within the sector, and how we contribute to those shared objectives. And I know we'll talk more about that, but I wanted to take a moment just to kind of situate the sector within the broader economy for those who are less familiar with what we do.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And like I said, I think we have, we often have a mental model of agriculture as farming, but as you just alluded to, it is expansive and touches all sorts of things, such as food processing as well. It's all around us. And so it makes sense to sort of think about that. Obviously, diversity, equity, and inclusion would be central to the way forward. Hannah, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Absolutely. And when you say we all have sort of a mental model of what farming looks like or what a farmer looks like, that's something that I love to blow apart for people. We know that, well, you know what, I would say too, something that we're realizing in agriculture is that we don't have a great data set about who is doing what. There's organizations that are working to provide better data for that. But the number that we throw around is that there's approximately 30% of farmers are female, either in an ownership position or a leadership position in their farm. So that is sort of one part where I would love to have the listener today sort of think about what they think of when they think of as a farmer. You're probably not thinking of me. You probably are, just like you opened up off the top, Melissa, thinking about a farmer in a plaid shirt with a pitchfork potentially. But I myself know, I have tons of friends and colleagues who are female farmers. We have on our podcast, we interviewed folks that are working to, or one guest in particular, who is working to support Indigenous landowners. So there is a growing movement of diversity in our sector. And I think what we want to contribute to, and what many voices in our sector want to contribute to, is supporting that and highlighting the various different types of folks who are contributing to that. And you also touched on our value chain and what the sector looks like there. And honestly, it's such an expansive chain. So when I think of people who are doing the research and breeding the varieties that eventually make it to my farm that I get to grow, that has a connection to climate change, right? We're hoping to incorporate drought tolerance into the varieties that I grow on my farm, all the way to food processing is an obvious one, but also like transportation, the grain that I grow to market or to processing. Policy people like Erin, there's 1 in 8 or 1 in 9 people in our country work in agriculture. So it is really an expansive industry with so much potential for growth.
I'd love to, so we mentioned that you guys have a podcast. I'd love to hear sort of what the impetus behind that was. Because again, when we think about DEI, I would think most folks' mental model is the corporate space, and not that agriculture isn't corporate, but do you know what I mean? Tell us about like how you started the diversity imperative and how that connects to how DEI is going to be a key factor in the agriculture sector's success.
I think that's what makes agriculture so cool, is that it does have that corporate space, but it also has, and Hannah can speak to that from her experience, right? It's deeply embedded in rural communities, and it contributes to that rural fabric across the country. And in terms of how we got this conversation started, it largely for Hannah and I started using social media to inspire others to contribute to the conversation. By no means are either one of us an expert in this space, but we did want to create a space to have the conversation. And I think we found it increasingly frustrating to try and fit that conversation into 140 characters. And so that's when the two of us came together and thought, how do we create a space where we can invite others to come in and have a more in-depth conversation and provide those really valuable perspectives that we don't always have an opportunity to hear.
And what's the feedback been like? I mean, I know in any industry there's pushback, but what are you finding as you're out there?
By and large, we've had fantastic feedback. We've had, when we launched the podcast, we had a number of messages come through immediately that said, thank you, we've been needing to have this conversation, or this was my experience, so thank you for having this conversation. And a lot of that was direct messaging, not necessarily, public discourse. So that was really motivating for us. And I guess to contrast that, we have also had some, I guess you would call it negative feedback, where people are saying, we're fine the way we are, and you're creating something out of nothing. But I feel like no matter where you are in this conversation, no matter what sector or what community you find yourselves in, there are that push and pull. But we know from our experiences as women in quote unquote leadership roles that these conversations are important, and that's enough to propel us forward. And I think one really important thing to Erin and I is that when we started to have these conversations, we were talking about our role as women, but we soon realized that you can't really be having this conversation without having an intersectional approach to it. And so that's what's so important to us on this podcast, is that we get to reach out and learn from other people who aren't like us, and then we then get to turn around and share it with people in our sector. So that's been really important to us, and what we want to keep making space for, because like Erin said, we are not experts, but we are advocates, and we are, keenly invested and interested in the conversation first.
So for those who are like me, who are just sort of really thinking about what this looks like, what DEI in agriculture looks like, could you paint us a picture about sort of what are the initiatives that are happening? I can imagine maybe corporate, but what does it look like in sort of the more rural areas? Because you mentioned, Erin, that we go from corporate to rural. Hannah, what does DEI look like to you?
Well, I guess from my perspective as a primary producer, we do have a largely white European descended population. That's sort of how land ownership has turned over in this country. So when we look at leadership on all the different boards and commissions that represent us as farmers, what we're trying to, seems like the first thing we're trying to work on is a better mix of gender diversity. Some information we have probably that's about 2 years old is that only 12% of boards and commissions across our country 12% of those seats are held by women. So that's a really easy goal, I think, that we can work on, is to get more women involved in farming in those leadership roles. So that's a big one for me. But through our podcast, we've had the chance to speak to an organization called Cargill. They're more what you would think of in the corporate space, as well as an organization called the Beef Farmers of Ontario. So they'd be a commodity group that represents their members as beef producers in Ontario. And so they're just two fantastic examples, and there are many more. These are just the two that we've sort of had a chance to connect with ourselves, that they're taking an inclusive approach to the leadership they provide. And so they're looking inwards to see what they can do to improve not only what's going on within their organization, but the way they interface with the public, publicly and one-on-one. And I think that is something that is kind of unique to our sector, actually. So myself as a wheat farmer, so I can join a commodity group that is representing wheat farmers and liaising with government. But what's unique about us is that we are largely probably a white male group, but we can learn from the public because that's who we're selling our product to. So that's sort of a unique thing to us, is that we get to think about the consumer on the other end of what we're selling. And so if you think about it from that perspective, diversity, equity, inclusion does matter. It should matter to us, and it does matter to us, even though, we are kind of a little bit restricted in terms of the demographic that we draw from for our leadership.
And Erin, what does it look like in your world?
A little different, because I don't have a farming background. And I lead a national association, so a more corporate environment, and that's been my background largely. And so the way I think a bit more about this is, I think I see the challenges that this sector has to overcome from a practical perspective. So I talked at the top about driving that competitive edge in an international marketplace, about helping the sector realize its full growth potential, about addressing some of the challenges that we face when we represent the interests of Canadian farmers with respect to climate change, for example, and how important tools, research and development, innovation will be for Canadian farmers like Hannah, especially in the face of climate change, for example. And so if we want to drive that innovation and we want to help grow this sector, we're competing for top talent. We want to attract the best and the brightest to this sector. And so to do that, we're competing, folks like me who don't have a farming background can do policy work or do R&D in a number of different sectors. And so what do we do to draw the best and the brightest to this sector, to attract them to agriculture? And so I think that increasingly now job seekers are looking at what your corporate culture, and by that I mean sort of more broadly what the sector offers in terms of its diversity and its approach to equity and inclusion. And I want them to see the sector, our sector, as being progressive. I want them to see themselves in the work that we do and find a home here, just as I have. And so I think that there's work to do to ensure that just as much as we love to talk about how innovative we are as a sector, we should be talking about how progressive we can also be as a sector. Those are some of the things that I think about when I think about how we can draw the best and the brightest to the fantastic work that we do in Canadian agriculture.
Love it. That's fantastic. So for the folks who are listening, what would you want them to take away from the conversation around where DEI is in terms of agriculture? Because I think it's really interesting because we've got Hannah, on the one hand, you're a farmer, and Erin, you are working sort of more in the corporate space. So how do, if we're thinking about people as really the main drivers towards creating a more diverse agriculture sector, how do you start to think about how you get people to see themselves in the sector? So what does that look like?
Well, I think one thing is that as a sector on the whole, we are experiencing the same challenges that other sectors and other communities are facing. We might be at a slightly different stage ahead or behind in certain areas, but that is something that's definitely consistent. And before I decided to farm with my family, I actually came from the research world. I worked at the University of Saskatchewan, and I would say that there's just many commonalities between certain challenges that exist when you want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our sector. So we need to keep, in my mind, sort of embracing those same strategies that you would embrace anywhere else. It just looks a little different for our sector. So, we've been privy to lots of conversations where that's been happening. And I think now we have to just keep with that momentum, right? So just hope that no matter where you are and what organization you're with, that you are sort of motivated by not only the moral imperative to these conversations, but also the business imperative as well.
And to that, I would only add, Melissa, that I think that creating a space for the conversation to exist is so critically important, because I think we can only speak from our own lived experience. And so the more open we are to hearing from others, to have a better appreciation for what their experience has been in our sector, we've got to be open to hearing that, because I think that's when we'll be open to change. And I can only speak to my own experience as a woman working in this sector. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I've so enjoyed the podcast, because I've got to hear from other people with different perspectives. But from my perspective, I'll know that we've made more progress, and we certainly are. We're getting there. But what I'd like to see is that issues related to women in agriculture aren't just women's issues anymore, that 95% of the feedback that we get on some of those conversations isn't just from women, that men want to be just as involved in the conversation because they see value in that too. And so from my perspective as a woman, when it's no longer a woman's issue and it's more about how do we create a diverse, equitable, and inclusive sector, that's for me a goal that I'd like to see our sector achieve.
I want to take a few minutes just to give you guys some space to talk about the Diversity Imperative podcast, because we're just starting season 2. Maybe you can tell us some of the conversations that you had in season 1, and then for folks who are interested to continue following you into season 2, what can they look forward to?
Absolutely. So, we created this podcast sort of as a space to have these conversations with our sector in mind. But I think that if, just any old person went and looked at our list of conversations we have had, they might find something interesting that would speak to them. And two conversations that were, I mean, they were all fantastic, but two that are really sticking with me were one conversation we had with Dr. Melissa Arcand, professor from the U of S, and then a sort of episode we did with Dr. Sarah Carter from the U of A. And so we were able to really dive deep into the history of Indigenous agriculture in Canada and how that is closely tied to Canadian history and development in the West. Of course, what are some of the important things we learned from that episode? That Indigenous folks attempted to farm, but they were not really allowed to do so based on government policy. And so really the first farmers on the land that we now call Canada were Indigenous people. And so those conversations were amazing. And I learned so much from them. And so those were, two of my favorites. How about you, Erin? What were you most moved by from season 1 in our summer series?
I think I like the approach that we took in the summer series, where we looked at whether it was a blog post or an article, a takeaway, and we took a deeper dive and talked to the authors behind those pieces. And I think what I like about those is you could very easily take a look at some of what they had to share and bring that to any sector at all, because those were really tangible tools that you could apply to diversity, equity, and inclusion, regardless of the sector in which you work. So I really appreciate the tools. And I think that's sort of what inspired our move to season 2, which was, okay, now that we've had an opportunity to explore the concept and familiarize ourselves and our listeners with the concept and bring different perspectives in, how do we give our listeners the tools to action some of what they've learned? Hopefully they're feeling inspired from season 1 and they want to do more in their organization. So what tools can we give them? So that's the approach we're going to take with season 2. We were so grateful, Melissa, to have you as our first guest and to bring some really valuable tools to our listeners who want to bring this great work back to their respective organizations. So we look forward to sharing some of what you had to say.
Thank you so much for having me. It was awesome. So yeah, folks, stay tuned because that episode will be coming out, and I'll be sure to point you to that so you can find us.
Yeah, so season 2 coming this spring. And you know what I love about listening to your podcast, Melissa, and the conversations that Erin and I get to have on the diversity imperative is that we really get to sort of sit with these concepts and sit with these discussions. You're not necessarily, rushing into action, which I think is what many of us want to do when we first learn about a new challenge. So that's what I love so much about, just podcasts in general. But with season 2, we are really trying to think about those small but tangible practical steps that you can implement in your own life, whether that's at home, in your community, or at work.
So I want to just open it up to offer you sort of the final word, Erin and Hannah, before I close out. I think, if there's anything that I've learned is that we need to sort of rethink what our mental model is of agriculture and farming, and that this is a sector that impacts 1 in 9 employees, and that it is vastly expansive, and that when we rethink sort of the sector, we can start to think about how DEI can be really pertinent to the growth and success of the sector. But yeah, so I think this, for me, I learned about just really shifting my mental model, but I want to let you guys have the last word.
Maybe I'll say I never imagined myself working in this sector, but I have found it so incredibly fulfilling and so rewarding. There are so many opportunities along the value chain to contribute to this sector. And I want others to feel the same way about working in Canadian agriculture. I want people to see themselves and to see the opportunities that we have available to them in the sector. And so I think that anything that we can do for those of us who are already here and loving every minute of it is to create the space to ensure that we can attract the very best and the brightest, so everyone sees themselves in the sector. And so I think that work is really important to us. It's ongoing, and I think it's especially important to me given my experience and how at home I now feel working in the sector.
Yeah, and I honestly couldn't have said it any better. So I think that's a perfect place to leave it.
Wonderful. So as I mentioned, if you're interested in learning more about the role of diversity, equity, inclusion in the agriculture sector, you can keep up with Hannah and Erin on their podcast, The Diversity Imperative, and we will definitely be linking out to that in the show notes. Hannah and Erin, thank you so much for being here. And to everyone who tuned in, thanks again for joining me on Just One Q. As always, if you have any of your own questions or would like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horn, and this has been Just One Q.